Well, let's see. What am I going to wear today? You know, that's a question that each of us has to ask ourselves every day. And there are several factors that help us answer that question. One factor would be, what am I going to be doing today? I'm not going to wear a suit if I'm going to be doing yard work. Another factor would be, of course, the weather. And I'm not going to wear short sleeves if it's going to be very cold outside. But you know, there's another factor that we need to consider every time we go to our closet, and that is the modesty factor. If you've been to the mall recently or turned on the television or looked at billboards as you've driven down the highway, then you know that our country has a serious problem with the way that we clothe ourselves. Sexually provocative is the way of the day, and it would certainly be an understatement to say that the world is confused with regard to how we should clothe ourselves. I want you to notice this cartoon that a friend of mine drew. In the cartoon, the doorbell rings, and one girl says, "Oh dear, that's the doorbell, and here I am in my underclothes." The other girl, who's actually wearing far less, says, "I'm dressed, I'll get it." I like the cartoon because it illustrates very well how confused our society is with regard to the clothing issue. And it's gotten to the point that people are really not even embarrassed about the exposure of their bodies. In fact, it's encouraged. There's a commercial that I've seen, I think it's about dieting, but the whole theme of the commercial is to lose enough weight so that this woman will be able to wear this little bitty bikini and to show off her body at the beach. And she's not embarrassed about it. You know, in Jeremiah chapter 6, Jeremiah says that the people of his day had lost the ability to blush. Listen to the words of Jeremiah 6:15. Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor did they know how to blush. And you know, we live in a world just like that today. Many people today have lost the ability to blush over the exposure of their bodies. They're just like the people of Jeremiah's day. They're not ashamed. I know a man in his 70s, and he told me that when he was young, girls blushed when they were ashamed. He said, but now they're ashamed when they blush. One preacher said, I'd like to find out what kind of fruit Adam and Eve ate that made them realize they were naked. He said, because I'd like to pass it around again. Now, he said that tongue-in-cheek, but he's right, because many people need to have their eyes opened about what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. Because again, the world is very confused with regard to this matter of clothing. But a Christian isn't like the world. A Christian can't be like the world. We're different. We've been called out of the world. 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. But very sadly, this problem of immodesty, lack of clothing, has affected Christians, and it's crept into the church. You know, there are some places where men don't want to serve on the Lord's table because of young ladies who are dressed immodestly in worship. And there are wives who don't want their husbands to teach the teenagers because of the way that some of the young girls are dressed, or maybe I should say the way they're not dressed. And you know, this is a very unpleasant subject to teach about. And sometimes it's embarrassing both to the one teaching it and also to the hearers. And sometimes people who like to dress immodestly get angry because they feel like they're being insulted. And sometimes when teachers teach on this subject, people will accuse them of having a dirty mind. And I guess that, along with the anger, has caused some to just avoid the subject altogether. I guess they feel like it's not worth the grief. But you know, if we're going to be pleasing to God, we have got to discuss it. We have got to be right about this matter, whether or not we want to admit it. When a woman goes into public in modern-day swimming wear, or she's wearing short shorts or a short skirt, or with her midriff exposed, or wearing clothes that are too tight, she's doing something that's sinful. She's taking the sexual impulses that God has instilled in men to draw husbands and wives together, and she's corrupting them. She's allowing them to be cheapened. Now, she might not know that she's doing it, but she's distorting sex as God designed it. Now, why is it the case that man is sexually impressed by the woman? You know, it's not an accident. It's because God made us that way. Now, why did he do that? Genesis 2:24, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. The reason man is sexually impressed by and attracted to woman is because of God's design. But you know, there's a big difference in the physical attraction of a husband and a wife and that of a man who is physically attracted to a stranger on the beach or at the pool or at the mall. First, let's talk about the husband and wife. The Bible says, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. Proverbs 5:18 and 19. Now, that's a husband and wife. Now listen to the difference. Here's a man and a woman to whom he's not married. Matthew 5:28 says, but I say unto you that whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, someone might try to rationalize and say, well, so long as nothing physical happens, there's nothing wrong with it. I heard someone say it's all right to look so long as you don't touch. But you know, that's not right. The Bible teaches that God is concerned not only with our actions, but also with our hearts, Matthew 5:28. And Job 31 and verse 1, Job said, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? You see, Job understood that it would be wrong even to look on a young lady in a lustful manner. All right, this matter of properly clothing ourselves is certainly important, and the world's very confused about it. And so what I want to do is to list some considerations to help guide us in knowing how we ought to dress ourselves. Number one, the first consideration should always be what God said, God's law. You know, sometimes people will say, well, the Bible really doesn't tell us how to dress ourselves. But that's not true. The Bible does tell us. Some of it's very specific, and some of it's in principle. But the Bible does tell us. Now, I want to begin in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25. The Bible says about Adam and Eve, they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, why were they not ashamed? Because apparently they weren't aware of the fact they were naked, according to verse 7. But after they ate of the forbidden fruit, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they were made aware of their condition. And they sewed fig leaves together, and they made themselves aprons. The New King James says coverings. Now, this word means a girdle or a loincloth. One version says they made themselves loin coverings. Another version says they covered themselves around the hips. But what's very interesting is that the clothing they made was apparently not adequate, because verse 21 says, also for Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. Now, this word for coats of skins is a tunic, a long shirt-like garment. Strong's Concordance even gives the definition of a robe. It was a garment that started at the shoulders and flowed down like a long shirt. Now, they had made themselves loin coverings, but the Lord made them robes and clothed them. Now, the implication seems to be that they were not adequately covered. And notice that when God came into the garden, Adam said, I was naked and hid myself. Now, he had fig leaves covering him in his loin area, but still he refers to himself as being naked. And God doesn't argue with him. God says, who told you that you were naked? Now, secondly, I want to consider another passage, this one from the book of Exodus, chapter 28. Now, the section of the chapter that we're going to be looking at is dealing with the making of the priest garments under the Mosaic system. Now, beginning in verse 40, the text says, this is from the New King James Version, for Aaron's sons you shall make tunics, and you shall make sashes for them, and you shall make hats for them for glory and beauty. So you shall put them on Aaron and his brother and on his sons with him. You shall anoint them, consecrate them, and sanctify them, that they may minister to me as priests. Now listen to verse 42. And you shall make for them linen trousers to cover their nakedness. They shall reach from the waist to the thighs. Now notice especially this phrase, they shall reach from the waist to the thighs. One version puts it this way, reaching from the hips to the knees. Now, what was the purpose of this garment? The text says to cover their nakedness. Thomas Eves, in his tract on modesty, he wrote, in the Old Testament it was considered nakedness when one had his thighs uncovered. and he cites this verse as proof. So what do we have so far? In order to be covered adequately, a garment started at the shoulders and it went down to the knees. Now, the third passage I want us to notice is from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. It says this, "In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works." Now, there are three things I want us to notice in this passage. The first one is modest, the word modest. Now, this word means orderly, well-arranged, or decent. The idea is that she's to adorn herself or beautify herself in a way as to not draw undue attention to herself. Now, in the immediate context, what he's discussing is a woman who's overdoing it. That is, she's overdressing. She's wearing flashy clothes and a lot of makeup and expensive jewelry. But you know, there's another way in which a woman could draw undue attention to herself, and that's by underdoing it. That is by wearing too little, by wearing clothes that are too tight or too low or too short or too thin or too revealing. Now, the second word I want us to notice is propriety. Now, the King James Version uses the word shamefacedness. The word propriety is actually closer to our modern-day word modest than the other one. The Greek word for shamefacedness or propriety means a sense of shame, modesty. It's used regarding the demeanor of women in the church. Now, the third phrase comes from verse 10, "but which is proper for women professing godliness." Now, let me introduce one more thing, and then we're going to put all of this together. This is from Titus chapter 2. It says that the older women are to teach the younger women to be chaste. Now, that word means pure from carnality, modest, perfect, or innocent. Now, that's the definition of Strong's and Vine's combined. Now, let's put it all together. A godly woman, then, is to dress in such a way so as to not draw undue attention to herself. She should have a sense of shame or modesty about her. She should be innocent and pure from carnality, and she should dress as a woman whose most important thing in life is to be pleasing to God. I'm sad to say that modern-day swimwear doesn't fit that definition. And a person who wants to please the Lord has no business being out in public in modern-day swimming attire. Now, that would include both bikinis and one-piece bathing suits. And these cut-off shirts that expose the midriff, they don't fit this description, this biblical definition of modest. Most modern-day cheerleading uniforms don't even remotely come close to fitting this description. A large deal of athletic wear and shorts and form-fitting clothes don't fit this description. And a sporting event doesn't change you modest into modest. And a wedding doesn't make you modest into modest. Being near water doesn't make you modest modest. Hot weather doesn't even make you modest modest. On one occasion, a woman had come in to speak with President Woodrow Wilson about some matter. And when the woman left the office, another man in the office said something about her being an intelligent and attractive woman. President Wilson replied, "She was a well-dressed woman." The man said, "I didn't notice what she was wearing." President Wilson said, "That's how I know she was well-dressed." Now, you might be thinking, you're talking a lot about the woman. Isn't modesty applicable to the man? And certainly it is. But you know what's interesting? When you read the Bible, generally the principles of modesty are applied to women, and passages prohibiting lust are applied to men. Now, is that because women never lust, or because modesty doesn't apply to men? In both cases, the answer is no. It's because of the way we're designed. Lust is generally a bigger problem for the man than the woman. But all of these principles of modesty also apply to the man. If a man goes into public with his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, or wearing no shirt at all, or wearing skin-tight jeans, he's doing something that is sinful, and no doubt something that could be a stumbling block for women. Now, that leads us to our second point. Our first consideration with regard to our clothing must be God. A second factor to consider when thinking about how to clothe myself, a second principle to guide me when determining how to dress, should be other people. If I'm living so as to please the Lord, then I don't want to do anything that would cause someone else to sin. I don't want to be a stumbling block in other people's path. And it is the case that the way I clothe or don't clothe myself can be a stumbling block for other people, which may lead them into sin. In Matthew 5:28, Jesus said, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Did you realize that I can commit a sin in my mind that can cause me to lose my soul? That's exactly what the Lord says in this passage. Now, with that in mind, when I'm purchasing clothing, I need to think about other people. I need to think about what effect this clothing may have on them. One author wrote, "The leading fashion designers admit that the reason behind the short skirts and bare skin is to seduce men." And Christians certainly don't want to do that. Listen to Luke chapter 17 and verse 1. It says, "It is impossible that no offenses should come, but woe to him through whom they do come." One version says, "How terrible for him for whom they come." I don't ever want to be the cause of another person stumbling. Some years ago, there was a survey that was done among high school boys, and they were asked the question, "Can a girl tempt a boy by the way she dresses?" 98% of the boys said yes. They were asked the question, "Does fashion use sex appeal?" 96% of the boys said yes. They were asked, "Do you believe that boys are more stimulated by sight than girls?" 92% said yes. "Do you believe the passions of boys are A, more easily aroused than girls, B, less easily aroused, or C, the same?" 87% answered A, more easily aroused. They were asked, "Do you feel that girls really understand the problem of immodest apparel?" 50% of the boys said no, we don't think so. They were asked, "Which part of the female body as seen in public most quickly arouses your emotions?" 60% of the boys answered legs. They were asked, "If you were married, would you want other men and boys to lust after your wife?" 96% said no. And then they were asked, "If she dressed like most girls do today, would most boys be tempted to lust after her?" 77% said yes. Now, what does this survey tell us? Well, for one thing, it should tell us that the way we dress can and does affect those around us. You know, sometimes people will say, "Well, it doesn't matter how I dress or how I don't dress. People are going to sin or they're not going to sin." I want you to think about 2 Samuel chapter 11. Here's King David, and he's walking on the roof of the king's house, and he sees Bathsheba washing herself, evidently unclothed, at least to some degree. And the Bible says she was very beautiful to look upon. And you know the story how David sent for her and committed adultery with her. Now, do you think that she would have had the same effect on David if she had been completely covered in a godly manner? I think we know the answer to that question. It is a fact that the way that we dress can tempt individuals in ways that they would not otherwise be tempted. Well, sometimes people will say, "Well, it's the person lusting who's sinning, not me. Evil is in the eye of the beholder." Well, first, that's not true. Secondly, it shows a very low regard for the souls of other people. And thirdly, it's not even logical. If evil is only in the eye of the beholder, as people say, then it would be okay for a person to go out in public totally nude, and the only one doing wrong would be the person who was the beholder. If a person has concern for the spiritual well-being of others, then that person should be careful about how they dress. I saw an excerpt from a church bulletin that had these words: "Dear sisters, on behalf of and for the benefit of men who are seeking to live in accordance with the will of God and to keep themselves pure and holy, to the end that you do not encourage them to lust, and for your own eternal welfare, please do not call undue attention to yourself or expose yourself by wearing immodest apparel. Godly men do not want to see your thighs or more in clothing that's too short, your cleavage in tops that are too low, your navel in tops that are too short, your undergarments in clothing that's too thin, nor the curves and characteristics of your body in clothing that is too tight. Please look in the mirror at yourself, front and back, and ask yourself if your attire is becoming one professing godliness. You may need to make some changes." Remember that the Lord said, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, in light of that, we need to consider other people when we're choosing our clothing. Now, a third consideration when we're thinking about how we're going to dress should be the church. For people who are members of the church, this is especially important because people who wear the name Christian are representatives of the Lord's body. And the way that I conduct myself reflects on the precious church of God. You know, there's a very interesting passage in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 2. It says, "You are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read by all men." Now, what's Paul saying there? He's saying that Christians are walking Bibles. You are living examples of our teachings. Now, what happens when Christians dress immodestly? Christians need to realize that they are a holy people, 1 Peter 1, 15 and 16. And as Christians, we need to set our mind on things that are above, not on things on the earth. We need to guard ourselves and not be conformed to this world, Romans 12:2. When other people know that I'm a member of the Church of Christ, and they hear me stand and defend the plan of salvation and what the Bible has to say about baptism and the proper type of worship, and then they see me dressed in provocative clothing or publicly engaging in practices that much of the world even views as sensual, how are they going to view the church? Now listen to this description of what Christ thinks about his church. "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself," now listen, "as a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish." Ephesians 5:25 through 27. Now, for just a minute, I want to talk about some of the false ideas that people have about immodest clothing. One idea that some people have is that immodest clothing is acceptable if you're involved in a sporting event. Now, we've already mentioned this briefly, but the Bible doesn't lay aside principles of modesty so that I can swim faster, or so that I can do gymnastics, or even to be a cheerleader. If you've ever watched the Summer Olympics, you know that in some of the sports, the clothing is nearly non-existent. And for some strange reason, even people who would normally oppose 95% nudity don't seem to have a problem with it because they say it's a sporting event. You know, it's a false idea, and God doesn't make exception for this. In the marriage relationship, it's appropriate to see each other so scantily clad. 1 Corinthians 7:4 says, "The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." But there's no verse that makes exception for sporting events. Number two, sometimes it's argued people see so much nakedness these days that they just really don't pay any attention to it anymore. But you know, that's simply not true. I might eat my favorite food until I'm sick of it, and I might lose my hunger for it. But God hasn't made us that way with reference to sexual desires. And besides, if that's the case, explain to me why cheerleaders wear those skimpy little uniforms even in the dead of winter. One preacher was talking about mixed swimming, and he wrote this. He said, "There's not an ordinary man who can look at a woman clad in nothing but a bathing suit for a long time without entertaining evil thoughts. But some will say it does not bother me." One who says that may be so young that his passions have not arisen, or he may be so old that they have subsided, or he may be so ignorant that he doesn't know what's going on, or he may not be normal, or he may be lying. He fits into one of these 5 categories, or he is a spiritual giant. But spiritual giants don't spend their time at mixed swimming parties. I think that's well said. Another false idea relates to our children. A parent might think, "But my daughter is just a child. Certainly she's not the object of lust." Well, certainly she's not to you, but what about a person of her own age? And you know what happens is our little girls so very quickly turn into little women, and that's when daddies need to step up and take the spiritual lead that God has assigned to them. You know, sometimes people have the idea that if a girl dresses immodestly, she is intentionally dressing so as to entice men. Now, while that may be true for some girls, it's certainly not true for all of them. God has made us different. Men and women are wired differently with regard to sexual desires. And many times, I think especially with young girls, they truly don't understand the effect that their clothing has on those of the opposite sex. And that's when daddies need to take the spiritual lead with reference to what's worn by his wife and by his daughters. How we clothe ourselves can have eternal implications both for us and for those around us. It can glorify God, or it can bring reproach on His church. And so our number one consideration cannot be, is this in style, or is this comfortable, or is this cool? Our number one consideration has to be, is this godly? Because eternally, none of those other things are going to matter.